Welcome to the BBB National Programs Podcast, The Bistro, where we will discuss today's hottest consumer trends, predict the future with consumer experts, and learn how elite businesses and entrepreneurs continue to push the envelope to meet and shape your needs as a consumer in the marketplace.
Hello, and welcome to the Bistro Podcast. I'm your host, Elena Spinola. Consumer reviews. Who doesn't look at them before making purchases, and who among us hasn't left one at some time or another? It definitely has become the norm, and many people feel compelled to leave reviews, both good and bad. And we also check them out before shopping, purchasing, or consuming anything from cars to spa services to restaurants and everything in between. While consumers rely on reviews to help them make buying decisions, businesses also rely on reviews for new customers and increased revenue. The hype around reviews and the influence they have on business has led some companies to protect themselves from negative reviews by adding provisions within their terms and conditions that strictly prohibit consumers from leaving their honest review. Some of these companies have followed through with lawsuits, and in other instances, they've penalized consumers for posting their negative reviews. In response to this, a law was passed in 2016 called the Consumer Review Fairness Act, which protects consumers' ability to, quote, share their honest opinions about a business's products, services, or conduct in any forum, including social media, unquote. Joining us today to help us understand the Consumer Review Fairness Act is Carl Settlemyer, an attorney with the FTC, the Bureau of Consumer Protection. Carl, welcome to the Bistro. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. One thing I would like to add is that my views are my own, not necessarily those of the commission or any commissioner.
Sure. So again, can you just help us understand the Consumer Review Fairness Act and why it was put into place?
So the Consumer Review Fairness Act, as you stated so well at the beginning, is a law that prohibits businesses from inserting gag clauses into their consumer form contracts to keep consumers from leaving their honest opinions in online reviews. And it was put into place because Congress was starting to see a trend, as was the FTC, of businesses looking to protect their reputations in a way that was way outside of what people were expecting and was really sort of destructive to the online review ecosystem. I mean, if you can't trust what's in there to be honest and candid, then it really makes it hard to look to reviews, and it really was threatening to do great harm to this great information source. I mean, it's not just a matter of your right to leave a review. It's really to protect your right to learn from other customers. And that's really why Congress decided to step in and make this law and make it very clear that this tactic was unacceptable, and there can be not only FTC actions against it, but there can be civil penalties for businesses that knowingly violate it. And consumers have the ability to assert this Consumer Review Fairness Act in court as a defense, because the Act basically makes these provisions void, and they cannot be enforced against you.
Got it. And what kind of consumer reviews are protected under the Consumer Review Fairness Act?
Pretty much anything, positive, negative. I mean, the main criteria is it's got to be an honest review. The Consumer Review Fairness Act doesn't bar a business from suing you for defamation, for libel, for slander, for saying false things that damage the business. So you need to keep it, keep it clean, keep it honest, and keep it within the footprint of your experience, because businesses can take action against customers who say false things or try to use that as a way to exert leverage over a business and get something they're not really entitled to. But in terms of most consumers leaving most reviews about their honest experience, about what they encountered with the business, that's protected.
Sure.
From the contract provision.
Got it. That makes sense. And as we said, the Consumer Review Fairness Act does make it illegal for companies to include standardized provisions that threaten or penalize people from posting their honest reviews. But here's a question, Carl. What if a company complies with the provisions, meaning they don't state it in writing on their website, right? But they go ahead and threaten or penalize an individual anyway. For example, not providing future service or not providing a refund, etc. How is that reported, and is this a violation?
Those type of things aren't necessarily Consumer Review Fairness Act violations. I mean, sometimes, a business may decide that it wants to withhold a refund unless you sign an agreement saying don't say bad things about us. And oftentimes that can be suspect under the Act. Again, if you're putting something in writing into a standardized contract that keeps people from saying positive, negative, or whatever things about you in exchange for, say, getting your money back if you didn't get the services you were promised, that can also be questionable. But overall, a business can sue you if you say something that is false, defamatory, and that's not restricted by the law.
Sure. Well, let's see if we can get an example. Can you share a specific case of a business that violated the CRFA, and what was the resulting consequence? So you don't need to name any specific business, but just give an example.
Sure. I can actually talk about 5 that we just entered into settlements with. The Commission has finalized consent agreements with 5 companies whose only violation of the law that was alleged was to use non-disparagement provisions and confidentiality provisions in their form contracts. One was a HVAC company. One was a property rental management company. One was a vacation rental company. One was a horseback riding company, which not only made it, a violation of their contract to say something bad about them, they could sue you $5,000 for each instance, and anything less than a 5-star review was going to trigger that contract provision. There was a flooring company in the Northeast that had this provision and this type of provision, and they had penalties as well if you were to violate it. So the Consumer Review Fairness Act was essentially violated by all these companies, and the Commission entered into agreements that prohibit them from using those provisions. It prohibits the companies from enforcing those provisions, and it required them to notify customers who entered into those contracts that the provisions were void.
Got it. And so how does something typically like this come to your attention? Is it from the consumer?
Well, we do get consumer complaints in our database, and we'll take a look at those. So if you, as a consumer, come across a provision like this, you can certainly go to ftc.gov and click on our complaints link and submit a complaint. And that allows the FTC, state attorney generals, and other law enforcement agencies to see what's going on with these companies. One thing that's important is that oftentimes businesses use these provisions because they're sort of in a misguided attempt to control their reputation. Maybe they've been burned by a bad experience. Oftentimes, businesses use these provisions because what they're doing as an underlying business isn't so great for consumers. So they use these type of provisions to mask what they're doing, to try to sanitize their reputation, and to try to keep people from noticing that they're running a scam in some cases. The Commission has actually brought cases against several companies that had other violations, like I think there was one that was kind of a work-at-home type of deal, where they had non-disparagement provisions in their contracts to keep the people who were basically being victimized by the scam from being able to report it.
So let's talk about those businesses. Under the CRFA, what can a business do and then also not do to a customer's review?
Basically, the Consumer Review Fairness Act prohibits the business from invoking these contract provisions to have the reviews taken down from a third-party website. There's nothing in the Consumer Review Fairness Act that requires a business to host a consumer's review on its own website. So sometimes we do get complaints that people say they posted a review of a business on its website, and the consumer thinks maybe it's a Consumer Review Fairness Act violation, but that may not be the case. As long as a business is not representing that it's including every single review of its products and its services on its website, as long as it's being careful in how it presents the information it gets from reviews, we can't use the Consumer Review Fairness Act to force them to carry other customers' reviews. You can curate as a business your own page as long as you're being upfront about what you're doing.
I see. So a business can be upfront that they may or may not be sharing every review, and then they could potentially share all the positive reviews and none of the negatives.
That's right, on their own site. But that's why these third-party websites, these review platforms, like Yelp, TripAdvisor, and many others are so important. And that's really where most of the benefit from the Consumer Review Fairness Act comes in.
Got it. Carl, let me ask you, is there any type of review that would constitute as, for example, slander under the law that a consumer needs to be aware of? And are there any exceptions or limits to the Consumer Review Fairness Act?
Well, the main one is that, yes, consumers can't say something that's falsely disparaging the business, and certainly something that doesn't actually represent your experience would be, illegal under other laws, state laws, and give the businesses a right to sue you, and that happens. But the general idea is that it's going to be inappropriate for these contract provisions to be the lever for a business to be able to take action. It really is going to come down to, what you're doing. I think most consumers would be well advised to, before you hit post on something, just take a deep breath, step away from the computer, and just think through, make sure that you're reading through it, what you're posting is true, and at that point, you should be in a good position. I mean, it's not something where a business couldn't try to sue you, couldn't try to take you to court. I mean, this is a country where we have a very robust legal system and a lot of people willing to use it. So that can be a factor. But ultimately, if you're saying what is your experience, you're telling the truth, that should be enough for most cases.
Sure. And so the Consumer Review Fairness Act is really all about protecting consumers' honest, personal experience with the business and the ability to share that.
That's right.
Basically. Great. And so, Carl, as we wrap up, can you just share the most important thing that both businesses and consumers should know when it comes to reviews and the CRFA?
Well, for the businesses, you need to know that the Act is going to stop you from using these type of contract provisions to control your reputation. From a consumer's perspective, you're often not going to notice these provisions if they are in a contract because they're in the fine print. And it won't be until after the fact when a business says, hey, you violated this contract provision, that you even find out it was there. Know in that case that you've got this resource. You can say to the business that this contract provision is void. You can report this to the FTC. And the other thing, if you do notice one of these provisions in a contract before you sign it, ask yourself, why is that there? It might be a red flag that you should wonder, what are you missing? What's been taken away from the reviews you have been able to find? Because a lot of times businesses that have been able to enforce these things have been able to get reviews taken down in the past. Now we're trying to, of course, crack down on that, but it's something that should raise a question in your mind as to why is this here and do I want to do business with this company?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for all of this information and for walking through this Customer Review Fairness Act. This is really important for both, again, consumers and businesses. Carl, we want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. One more time, can you share your website so that our listeners can go and learn more about the information like what you shared today?
Yes. The FTC's website is ftc.gov, and there is a link for people to be able to submit complaints, and that's a great resource for the FTC.
Thank you for sharing so much. And again, we want to thank our listeners. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope you found it helpful and informative. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review the Bistro podcast. For BBB National Programs, I'm Elena Spinola. And until next time, it has been my pleasure discussing better business and consumer rights with you.
You just enjoyed the Bistro podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To learn more about our other shows, visit betterbusiness.blueberry.com. That's betterbusiness.blueberry.com. Follow us on Twitter at BBB_NTL programs. Send your comments and ideas to podcast@bbbnp.org. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guest, not those of the BBB National Programs or its affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Blueberry's Terms of Service.